The autumn sun hung low over the distant mesas as Abigail Zimmerman clutched the eviction notice in her trembling hands, the weight of her world crashing down upon her shoulders with each passing second. The year was 1875, and Trinidad, Colorado was a town that had given little and taken much from the 24-year-old widow who now stood on the weathered porch of the small homestead she could no longer call her own. "You have until the end of the week, Mrs. Zimmerman," the bank manager had said with practiced indifference. "We've been more than accommodating considering your situation." Her situation was what polite society called being widowed at 23 with no family, no money, and no prospects. 18 months had passed since influenza had claimed her husband Thomas, leaving her alone to manage a struggling horse ranch that had been his dream, not hers. Now the drought that had plagued the region for nearly a year had withered her last hopes along with the parched grass of the eastern Colorado plains. Abigail folded the notice and tucked it into the pocket of her faded blue work dress. She surveyed what remained of her life, the modest cabin Thomas had built with his own hands, the small stable now empty save for her aging mare, Penny, and the vast expanse of land that had once promised so much. The golden light of the setting sun painted everything in a deceptively beautiful glow, as if mocking her predicament. The creak of wagon wheels pulled her from her thoughts. A cloud of dust announced the approach of a visitor, an uncommon occurrence this far from town. Abigail brushed away the tears she hadn't realized she'd shed and straightened her shoulders. She wouldn't face whatever came next with weakness. The wagon came into view, drawn by two sturdy chestnut horses. The driver, a man Abigail didn't recognize, pulled the team to a halt at her gate. He was tall and lean, his face partially obscured by the wide brim of his worn Stetson. A dusty duster coat covered his frame, and she could see the glint of spurs on his boots as he jumped down from the wagon with practiced ease. "Evening, madam," he called, removing his hat to reveal tousled dark hair and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Name's Luke Sinclair. I believe I might be lost." Abigail's hand instinctively moved to the shotgun that leaned against the porch railing. Trinidad might be growing into a respectable town, but the wild still lurked at its edges, and a woman alone couldn't be too careful. "You're on Zimmerman land," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Trinidad's about 5 miles east. You can't miss it." The stranger Luke nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, his eyes traveled over the property with an appraising gaze that made Abigail uncomfortable. "I'm actually looking for work, not directions," he said finally. "Heard at the saloon in town that the Zimmerman place might need a hand." "That true?" Abigail nearly laughed at the cruel irony. "You're about a week too late, Mr. Sinclair. There won't be a Zimmerman place come Friday." Something flickered across his face, disappointment, perhaps, before he composed himself again. "Bank troubles?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Among other things," Abigail admitted, not entirely sure why she was sharing this with a stranger. "Droughts killed most of what we had, and I can't keep up with the mortgage payments. Banks foreclosing." Luke Sinclair placed his hat back on his head and approached the porch steps, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mind if I water my horses before moving on? Been a long ride." It was a simple request, one that basic Western hospitality required her to grant. "Pumps around back," she said with a nod. "Help yourself." He tipped his hat in thanks and led his team toward the back of the property. Abigail watched him go, noting the easy way he moved, the confident set of his shoulders. He was clearly a man accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life. When he returned a few minutes later, he was leading his horses, having apparently unhitched them from the wagon. "Your well's running low," he commented, Barely enough to satisfy these two. Everything's running low these days, Abigail replied bitterly. Luke Sinclair studied her for a long moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. I've got a proposition for you, Mrs. Zimmerman. I'm heading up to my brother's place near Pueblo. He's got work for me, but I'm not expected for another 3 weeks. I could stay on here until then, help you get things in order before. He trailed off, evidently not wanting to directly reference her impending eviction. I can't pay you, Abigail said bluntly, and there's not much point in fixing up a place that won't be mine in a week. I don't need money, he replied. Just a place to stable my horses and maybe a corner to sleep in your barn. In exchange, I'll do whatever needs doing around here. Might make leaving easier if things are in proper order. Abigail considered his offer. Having a man around the place might keep the vultures at bay, those who were already circling, waiting to pick over whatever she might leave behind in her hasty departure. And the thought of sorting through Thomas's things alone had been weighing heavily on her mind. The barn's yours if you want it, she finally agreed, but I can't promise anything beyond that. Luke nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. I'll get my things settled, then see what needs attention before sundown. As he walked back to his wagon, Abigail couldn't help but wonder about this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere, offering help when she needed it most. In her experience, men rarely gave without expecting something in return. Still, she was in no position to turn away assistance, no matter how temporary it might be. The following morning, Abigail woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Luke Sinclair repairing the sagging steps of her porch, a collection of tools spread out beside him. "Morning," he called, glancing up from his work. "Hope I didn't wake you too early." "I've been up with the sun since I was a girl," she replied, moving past him to retrieve water from the pump for her morning coffee. "Didn't expect you to start so early, though." Luke shrugged, driving another nail into the freshly cut wood. "Daylight's valuable out here. No sense wasting it." Abigail returned to the cabin and set about preparing a simple breakfast. After a moment's hesitation, she made enough for two. It seemed only right to offer the man food if he was working on her behalf, even if she couldn't pay him. When she called him in to eat, he washed up at the basin outside before entering the cabin, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door with a natural familiarity that caught Abigail off guard. He reminded her, painfully, of Thomas, the way he moved with purpose, the respectful way he entered her home. "This is mighty kind of you, Mrs. Zimmerman," he said, taking the seat she offered at the small table. "Abigail," she corrected him, serving up plates of cornbread and beans. "If you're staying on to help, we might as well dispense with formalities." "Abigail," he repeated with a slight smile. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Luke spoke again. "I took a look around your property at first light. Your fences need mending in the north section, and that barn roof won't last another hard rain. I can fix both without much trouble." "Like I said, there's not much point," Abigail replied, though with less conviction than before. "The bank will sell this place as soon as they can, regardless of its condition." Luke regarded her thoughtfully as he finished his meal. "Sometimes it's not about what happens to the place after you're gone," he said. "It's about leaving with dignity, knowing you didn't surrender completely." His words struck a chord within her, one that resonated with the stubborn pride that had kept her going since Thomas's death. She'd fought to keep this place, fought against the odds and the elements, and the whispers in town that a woman couldn't manage alone. She'd failed, yes, but perhaps there was still value in not giving up entirely. "The north fence, you said?" she asked, conceding his point without directly acknowledging it. Luke nodded, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. I'll start there after breakfast if that's agreeable to you. I'll help, Abigail decided. No sense in you doing all the work alone. For 3 days, they fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Luke would rise before dawn, tend to his horses and her mare, and begin the day's work. Abigail would prepare meals and work alongside him, her capable hands matching his pace as they repaired fences, patched the barn roof, and cleared a small irrigation channel that had become clogged with debris. On the 4th day, as they sat on the porch steps drinking coffee after a long morning of work, Abigail finally asked the question that had been on her mind since his arrival. "Why are you really helping me, Mr. Sinclair?" She watched his face carefully as she spoke. Most men would have ridden on when they heard there was no paying work to be had. Luke set his coffee cup aside and met her gaze directly. "Luke," he corrected her with a small smile, "and I suppose I know something about losing everything. Makes a person want to ease that burden for others when they can." "You've lost a home?" Abigail asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "Home, family, purpose, lost it all in the war," he said simply. "Came west afterward like so many others looking for something new. Been drifting ever since, taking work where I can find it." "Which side?" The question slipped out before Abigail could stop it, though she immediately regretted its bluntness. "Union," Luke replied without hesitation, "though I've learned there's little point in carrying those divisions forward." Too much was lost on both sides. Abigail nodded, understanding in her silence. The war had ended a decade ago, but its shadows still stretched across the country, touching lives in ways both subtle and profound. "My husband, Thomas, he came west before the fighting began," she said, surprising herself with the confidence she felt in sharing this with him. "Said he wanted no part in killing other Americans. We met in Denver, married young. This place was his dream." She gestured to the land around them. "I just went along with it." "And now," Luke asked gently, "what's your dream, Abigail?" The question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her dreams in so long that she wasn't sure she remembered how to articulate them. "Survival, I suppose," she finally said. "One day at a time." Luke didn't press her further, seeming to understand that some wounds were still too fresh to probe. Instead, he changed the subject. "I noticed you've got quite a collection of books inside. Unusual out here." "Thomas believed in education," Abigail explained, grateful for the shift in conversation. "Said just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean we had to think like frontiersmen. He taught at the school in town before he got sick." "A teacher," Luke nodded appreciatively. "Explains the Shakespeare I saw on your shelf. Not common reading for ranchers." Abigail smiled despite herself. "He would read aloud in the evenings. Said the words were meant to be heard, not just seen on a page." They lapsed into silence again, but it was comfortable rather than strained. The midday sun beat down on them, but a light breeze from the mountains made the heat bearable. "Tomorrow's the deadline," Abigail said finally, giving voice to the thought that had been weighing on her all day. "The bank manager will be coming out to make sure I'm complying with their orders to vacate." Luke's expression hardened slightly. "I've known men like him. They hide behind papers and policies, never having to face the consequences of their decisions." "He's just doing his job," Abigail said, though there was little conviction in her defense. "The droughts hit everyone hard. They can't make exceptions even for widows." "Maybe not," Luke conceded. "But there's usually more than one way to solve a problem. Have you considered all your options?" Abigail laughed, a short, bitter sound. "What options?" "I have no family to turn to, no savings, and precious few skills that would earn me a living in town. The only option most women in my position have is to find another husband, and I've had enough well-meaning suggestions in that direction to last a lifetime." Luke didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains as if searching for something in their immutable presence. "What if you could keep this place?" he asked finally. "Would you want to?" "It doesn't matter what I want," Abigail replied, standing abruptly. "Some things can't be fixed with good intentions and a few days' work, Mr. Sinclair." She gathered their empty cups. "I appreciate your help, truly I do, but there's no miracle waiting to save me from what comes tomorrow." She retreated into the cabin, needing space to compose herself before the tears threatening to fall could betray her. It had been easier, somehow, when she'd faced her fate alone, resigned to it, without the cruel rekindling of hope that Luke's presence had sparked. Later that afternoon, Abigail was sorting through the small trunk of personal belongings she intended to take with her when she left the homestead. Each item she touched carried memories. The lace handkerchief from her wedding day, a pressed wildflower Thomas had given her during their courtship, the small wooden horse he'd carved for the child they'd hoped to have someday. A soft knock at the open door interrupted her reverie. Luke stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his expression serious. "May I come in?" he asked, respecting the boundary of her personal space despite having worked alongside her for days. Abigail nodded, closing the trunk and rising to face him. "I'm heading into town," he said. "Thought I might speak with someone at the bank, see if there's any flexibility in their position." Abigail shook her head. "You'd be wasting your time. I've tried everything: extensions, partial payments, offers to work off the debt. They've made up their minds." "Nevertheless, I'd like to try," Luke insisted gently. "Sometimes a fresh perspective can reveal solutions others might miss." Abigail wanted to argue further, to protect herself from the inevitable disappointment of raised hopes, but something in Luke's steady gaze stopped her. "Do what you think best," she said finally, "but don't expect miracles." After Luke had ridden off toward town, Abigail continued her preparations for departure. She had arranged to stay temporarily with Mrs. Fletcher, the widow who ran the boarding house in Trinidad, until she could find more permanent arrangements. The thought of living in town, surrounded by people yet fundamentally alone, filled her with dread. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Abigail stepped onto the porch and surveyed her land one last time. Despite her earlier words to Luke, this place had become her dream too, somewhere along the way. The wide open spaces, the distant mountains, the sense of building something that was truly there she had come to love it all. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered to the gathering dusk. "I tried to keep it going. I really did." The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where Luke was returning from town. As he drew closer, Abigail could see that his expression was grave, and her heart sank. She had known his mission was futile, yet some small part of her had dared to hope. Luke dismounted and secured his horse before joining her on the porch. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken disappointment. "The bank wouldn't budge," he finally said, confirming what she had already guessed. "The manager, Harrison, was particularly unsympathetic." Abigail nodded, accepting the news with the resigned dignity she had cultivated over the past difficult year. "I expected as much. Thank you for trying anyway." Luke leaned against the porch railing, his gaze fixed on some distant point. "There might be another way," he said carefully. "But I'm not sure you'll like it." Abigail felt a flicker of both hope and apprehension. "What other way?" "I spoke with a man named Carlson at the saloon," Luke explained. "He owns the largest ranch this side of the Purgatoire River. Says he's been looking to expand his grazing lands, might be interested in buying this place before the bank can auction it." Abigail frowned. "Edward Carlson. I know of him. His ranch borders the western edge of our property. Thomas always said he was fair in his dealings, but..." But you'd still be losing your home, Luke finished for her. The difference is you'd get something for it, enough to start fresh somewhere else on your own terms. Abigail considered this. Selling to Carlson would mean giving up her land voluntarily, but it would also provide her with the financial means to determine her own future, rather than being cast out with nothing. "Did he make an offer?" she asked cautiously. Luke nodded. "He'll pay off your debt to the bank and give you an additional $100. It's not a fortune, but it's something." It was more than she had dared hope for, yet the thought of willingly surrendering Thomas's dream left a bitter taste in her mouth. "When does he want an answer?" "He's riding out here tomorrow morning before the bank manager arrives," Luke replied. "Said he'd bring the papers and money with him if you're agreeable." Abigail turned away, unable to face the compassion in Luke's eyes. "I need to think about this." "Of course," he said, straightening up. "I'll see to the animals before dark. Take all the time you need." As Luke walked toward the barn, Abigail felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her. Selling to Carlson meant acknowledging that her life here was truly over, that all her efforts to maintain Thomas's legacy had ultimately failed. Yet it also offered a measure of control over her circumstances that she hadn't possessed before. Darkness fell, bringing with it a profound silence broken only by the occasional call of a night bird or the distant howl of a coyote. Abigail sat at her small kitchen table, a single lantern illuminating the room as she contemplated her options. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Luke stood in the doorway, a plate of food in his hands. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, offering the simple meal of beans and biscuits he had prepared. "You didn't come out for supper." Abigail accepted the plate with murmured thanks, suddenly aware that she hadn't eaten since their midday meal. "Join me," she asked, gesturing to the chair across from hers. Luke hesitated only briefly before taking the offered seat. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the simple act of sharing food providing a comfort that words could not. "I think I'll accept Carlson's offer," Abigail said finally, having reached her decision during the quiet meal. "It's not what I wanted, but it's better than being thrown out with nothing." Luke nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Where will you go?" It was a question Abigail had been asking herself all evening. "Denver, perhaps," she replied. "Or maybe farther east. There are teaching positions for women now, and I have enough education to qualify." "You'd make a fine teacher," Luke observed. "You've got patience and determination, both necessary qualities." "High praise from a man who's known me less than a week," Abigail said with a small smile, the first genuine one she'd managed all day. "Some people reveal their character quickly in times of adversity," Luke replied simply. They lapsed into silence again, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken between them now, a mutual recognition, perhaps, of qualities admired in the other. "What about you?" Abigail asked eventually. "After your brother's place in Pueblo, where will you go?" Luke considered the question, his stormy eyes reflecting the lantern's flame. "I haven't decided. Been drifting so long it's become a habit hard to break. Don't you ever want to settle somewhere?" The question was personal, perhaps too much so for their brief acquaintance, but Abigail found herself genuinely curious about this enigmatic man who had entered her life at its lowest point. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when I see a place like this, with good land and mountains on the horizon. Yes, I think about staying put, building something lasting." He smiled ruefully. "Then I remember all the responsibilities that come with putting down roots, and the open trail starts calling again." Abigail understood his hesitation better than most. Building something meant the pain of potentially losing it, a lesson she had learned all too well. "Thank you," she said suddenly, the words emerging unbidden. For everything you've done here. You didn't have to help me, but you did. I won't forget that." Luke's expression softened. "You'd have managed without me, Abigail Zimmerman. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." His words warmed something within her that had been cold for too long. Before she could respond, however, Luke rose from his seat. "It's late," he said. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Best we both get some rest." Abigail nodded in agreement, and Luke bid her good night before returning to his makeshift bed in the barn. Left alone, she cleared away their dishes and prepared for bed, her mind still turning over the events of the day and the decision that awaited her in the morning. Sleep came fitfully, her dreams filled with images of the land she was about to lose and the uncertain future that lay ahead. When dawn finally broke, Abigail rose with a sense of resignation tempered by the small comfort of having made her choice, rather than having it forced upon her. She dressed with care in her best remaining dress, a simple blue calico that had seen better days but was still presentable, and pinned her honey blonde hair in a practical bun. If she was to sell her home, she would do so with dignity. Luke was already up when she emerged from the cabin, tending to the horses and preparing for the visitors they expected. He had cleaned up as well, his dark hair neatly combed and his shirt freshly laundered. "Carlson should be here within the hour," he informed her as she joined him by the corral. "The bank manager typically makes his rounds after 10, so we should have time to conclude your business before he arrives." Abigail nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began hesitantly. "About me being stronger than I think. I'm not sure that's true, but I'm trying to believe it." Luke's gaze met hers, direct and unwavering. "Strength isn't about never faltering, Abigail. It's about continuing on despite every reason to stop. By that measure, you're among the strongest people I've ever met." Before she could respond to his unexpected praise, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the road. Two men on horseback were making their way toward the homestead Edward Carlson, a substantial man in his 50s with a well-trimmed beard, and his foreman, a younger man whose hard eyes surveyed the property with calculating interest. Luke placed a supportive hand briefly on Abigail's arm before stepping forward to greet the visitors. Abigail straightened her shoulders and followed, determined to face this final chapter with the strength Luke seemed so certain she possessed. "Mrs. Zimmerman," Carlson called as he dismounted, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Sinclair here tells me you might be amenable to selling your property." "I'm considering it," Abigail replied carefully, not wanting to appear too eager, "depending on the terms, of course." Carlson nodded approvingly, apparently pleased by her business-like approach. "Straight to the point. I appreciate that in a person." He gestured toward the house. "Perhaps we could discuss the details inside." Abigail led the way to the cabin, acutely aware of the scrutiny under which her home now found itself. Luke and Carlson's foreman remained outside, leaving her alone with the rancher as they sat at her kitchen table to review his offer. The terms were, as Luke had described, payment of her debt to the bank, plus an additional $100. Carlson would take possession immediately, allowing her 3 days to remove any personal belongings before his men would begin integrating the property into his larger operation. "It's a fair offer," Carlson said as Abigail studied the papers he had brought. "More than fair, given the condition of the land after this drought." "The land will recover when the rains return," Abigail countered. "It's good grazing country." "Indeed it is," Carlson agreed readily. "That's why I want it. But the bank will have it by noon if you don't sell to me, and then you'll walk away with nothing but what you can carry." His words, though blunt, were true. Abigail knew she had little choice but to accept his terms. Still, Something made her hesitate, some lingering attachment to this place that had been her home for 5 years. "I need a moment," she said, rising from the table. "Please excuse me." Stepping onto the porch, Abigail found Luke leaning against the railing, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something among the distant hills. He turned at her approach, a question in his gaze. "The offer is exactly as you said," she told him quietly, mindful of the others nearby. "I should accept it, I know that, but it still feels like giving up," Luke finished for her, understanding in his voice. Abigail nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within her. "Is it foolish to feel this way, to want to hold on to something that's already lost?" Luke considered her question carefully before answering. "Not foolish," he said finally. "Human. We all want to believe that enough determination can overcome any obstacle." He gestured toward the drought-stricken land around them. "But sometimes, the smartest choice is to recognize when a battle can't be won and preserve your strength for the next one." His words resonated with the pragmatic part of Abigail's mind, the part that had known for months that this day would eventually come. Yet still she hesitated, caught between acceptance and a desperate wish for some alternative she couldn't even imagine. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, the confession costing her more than Luke could know. Luke's expression softened. "Yes, you do," he said gently. "You're just looking for permission to do it. Sign the papers, Abigail. Take Carlson's money and start again on your own terms. There's no shame in that." The simple truth of his statement cut through the tangle of emotions that had been paralyzing her. With a deep breath, Abigail straightened her shoulders and nodded once, decision made. "Thank you," she said quietly before turning to re-enter the cabin. Carlson looked up expectantly as she took her seat at the table once more. "Well, Mrs. Zimmerman, do we have an agreement?" "We do," Abigail replied, reaching for the pen he offered. "On one condition." Carlson's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what might that be?" The mare in the barn penny. "She stays with me. She's not part of the property sale." For a moment, Carlson looked as if he might object, but then he nodded. "The horse is yours to take. Not much use to me anyway, at her age." Relief washed over Abigail as she signed the papers, transferring ownership of the land that had been her home to a man who saw it only as an extension of his empire. When she had finished, Carlson counted out the agreed-upon sum, the bank draft and cash representing both the end of one chapter in her life and the potential beginning of another. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you, Mrs. Zimmerman," Carlson said as he gathered the signed documents. "I wish you luck in your future endeavors." The transaction concluded, Carlson and his foreman prepared to depart. Before mounting his horse, the rancher turned to Luke, who had been watching the proceedings from a respectful distance. "That offer of work still stands, Sinclair," he said. "Could use a man with your skills at my place." Luke touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement but made no commitment. "Appreciate the offer, Mr. Carlson. I'll keep it in mind." As the two men rode away, Abigail stood on her porch, not her porch anymore, clutching the payment for her land and watching as dust settled on the road behind them. "Are you all right?" Luke asked, coming to stand beside her. "I don't know," Abigail answered honestly. "I've known this was coming for months, but now that it's done." She trailed off, unable to find the words to express the emptiness she felt. "It's never easy letting go of something you've put your heart into," Luke said quietly. "Takes courage to walk away with your head held high." Abigail managed a small, sad smile. "Is that what I'm doing? It feels more like running away." "There's a difference," Luke assured her. "Running away is what happens when fear drives you. Walking away happens when wisdom guides you." Before Abigail could respond, the sound of another approaching horse caught their attention. The bank manager, Harrison, was arriving earlier than expected, his pinched expression visible even from a distance. "Looks like you signed those papers just in time," Luke observed. Harrison pulled his horse to a stop before the cabin and dismounted stiffly, his disapproving gaze taking in Abigail and Luke as if finding them both wanting. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he began without preamble, "I trust you're prepared to vacate the premises as agreed." "The bank is prepared to take possession immediately." "That won't be necessary, Mr. Harrison," Abigail replied, a newfound confidence in her voice as she handed him the bank draft from Carlson. "This should cover my debt to your institution in full. I've sold the property to Mr. Carlson." Harrison examined the draft with obvious surprise. "I see," he said finally, his tone suggesting he was disappointed to be denied the satisfaction of evicting her. "Very well. I'll process this at the bank and send confirmation that your account is settled." He tipped his hat with grudging respect. "Good day, Mrs. Zimmerman." As Harrison rode away, Abigail felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief that her debt was settled, sadness at the finality of the sale, and an unexpected sense of liberation now that the worst had happened and she had survived it. "What now?" Luke asked, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. Abigail looked around at the homestead that had been her life for 5 years. "Now I pack what I can take and make arrangements to stay in town until I decide where to go next." Luke nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can help with the packing if you'd like, and I've got room in my wagon for whatever you want to bring." His offer touched Abigail deeply. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose further. You've done more than enough already." "It's no imposition," Luke insisted. "My brother isn't expecting me for another 2 weeks, and I'd rather be useful than idle." Abigail hesitated, weighing her pride against practicality. Having Luke's help would make the transition considerably easier, and she had to admit, if only to herself, that she wasn't ready to face this next challenge entirely alone. "All right," she agreed finally. "I'd be grateful for your help." They spent the remainder of the day sorting through Abigail's belongings, separating what she would take from what must be left behind. Luke worked efficiently, never questioning her decisions about what to keep or discard, simply offering support through his quiet presence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land that was no longer hers, Abigail stood in the doorway of the cabin, surveying the stacked crates and trunks that represented all she would carry forward from this chapter of her life. "We can load the wagon tomorrow," Luke said, coming to stand beside her. "Make an early start for town." Abigail nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the finality of it all. "I never thought it would end like this," she said softly. "When Thomas and I came here, we had such dreams for this place." "Dreams can change," Luke observed gently. "Doesn't mean they're lost, just transformed." Abigail turned to look at him, struck by the wisdom in his words. "Is that what happened to your dreams after the war? They transformed?" Luke's gaze grew distant, as if seeing something far beyond the physical landscape before them. "Some of them died," he admitted. "Others went dormant for a long while. But yes, eventually they changed into something else, something I'm still trying to understand." His honesty moved her. This glimpse into the heart of a man who had clearly suffered losses of his own, yet continued to move forward. In that moment, Abigail felt a connection to Luke Sinclair that transcended their brief acquaintance, a recognition of shared experience that needed no words to validate. "I should see about supper," she said finally, reluctant to end the moment but aware of practical necessities. "I brought in some rabbits earlier," Luke offered. "Thought we could use a proper meal after the day we've had." Abigail smiled, grateful for his thoughtfulness. "I'll stew them with the last of the vegetables from the garden. Seems fitting for our last night here." They worked together to prepare the meal, moving around the small kitchen with an easy familiarity that belied their short time together. As they ate by lantern light, Abigail found herself studying Luke covertly, wondering about the life he had led before their paths crossed, and where he might go after they inevitably parted ways. "You're awfully quiet," Luke observed as they finished their meal. Having second thoughts about the sale, Abigail shook her head. "No, what's done is done. I was just thinking about tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that." She met his gaze directly. "Do you ever get tired of not knowing what comes next, of having no fixed point to return to?" Luke considered her question carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes," he admitted. "There are nights when the open sky feels more like a burden than a freedom. But then, I remember what it was like to be trapped in a place I couldn't leave, fighting a war I didn't fully understand, and the open road seems like a blessing again." "I can understand that," Abigail said softly. "After being tied to this land for so long, watching it slowly die despite everything I tried. Part of me welcomes the chance to go somewhere new, somewhere the memories aren't waiting around every corner." Luke nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Where do you think you'll go?" "You mentioned Denver earlier. Denver, maybe, or Colorado Springs, somewhere with opportunities for a woman on her own." Abigail sighed, the uncertainties of her future weighing heavily upon her. "Wherever I can make a fresh start." "You've got the means now," Luke reminded her. "And the freedom to choose." "Freedom can be frightening when you're not used to it," Abigail observed wryly. "True enough," Luke agreed with a small smile, "but it can be exhilarating too once you embrace it." As they cleared away the remains of their meal, Abigail found herself reluctant to end the evening, to face the solitude of what would be her final night in the cabin she had shared with Thomas. Luke seemed to sense her hesitation, for he made no move to return to the barn, instead taking a seat on the small sofa near the fireplace. "Would you mind if I looked at your books?" he asked, gesturing toward the small shelf that held Thomas's collection. "Been a while since I had access to proper reading material." "Help yourself," Abigail replied, pleased by his interest. Thomas would have liked knowing they were being appreciated. Luke selected a volume of Tennyson's poetry and settled back to read, the lantern light casting a warm glow over his features as he became absorbed in the pages. Abigail busied herself with final preparations for their departure the next day, sorting through the last of her personal items and packing them carefully. As the evening wore on, a comfortable silence enveloped them, broken only by the occasional turning of a page or the soft sounds of Abigail's movements around the cabin. It was a peaceful interlude in what had been a tumultuous day, a brief respite before the changes that awaited them both. Eventually, Luke closed the book and rose to his feet. "I should let you get some rest," he said, returning the volume to its place on the shelf. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Abigail nodded, though she was reluctant to see him go. His presence had become a steadying influence in the chaos of her circumstances, a reminder that she was not facing her challenges entirely alone. "Thank you again," she said as he moved toward the door. "For everything." Luke paused, his hand on the doorknob, and turned back to face her. "No need for thanks, Abigail. Some paths just happen to cross when they're most needed." With that, he bid her good night and stepped out into the darkness, leaving Abigail to ponder the curious twist of fate that had brought him to her door at precisely the moment when she had most needed a friend. Morning came all too soon, the first light of dawn filtering through the curtains to find Abigail already awake, her night having been punctuated by fitful dreams and long periods of contemplative wakefulness. She rose and dressed quickly, knowing that the sooner they began their journey to town, the sooner this painful transition would be behind her. Luke was already loading the wagon when she emerged from the cabin, his efficient movements speaking of long practice. He greeted her with a nod and a gentle smile, seeming to understand without words that this morning was particularly difficult for her. They worked side by side, loading her remaining possessions into the wagon until all that remained was a final walk through the empty cabin to ensure nothing important had been left behind. Abigail paused in each room, memories washing over her like waves. Thomas building the kitchen table by lamplight, their first winter huddled near the fireplace during a blizzard, the quiet evening spent reading aloud to each other when the day's work was done. "Are you ready?" Luke asked softly from the doorway, respecting her need for these final moments alone with her past. Abigail took a deep breath and nodded, accepting that it was time to move forward. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I'm ready." Outside, the morning sun illuminated the land in golden light, the beauty of it a bittersweet reminder of what she was leaving behind. Penny was hitched alongside Luke's horses, ready for the journey to town. All that remained was to depart. As Luke helped her up onto the wagon seat, Abigail cast one final glance at the homestead, the cabin with its newly repaired porch, the barn with its patched roof, the corral where Thomas had planned to raise horses someday. It was no longer hers, yet it would always be a part of her story. "I'll hope this place treats Carlson well," she said quietly as Luke took the reins. "It deserves to thrive again." Luke nodded in understanding. Land like this always finds a way to come back, given time and care, just like the people who work it. With a gentle flick of the reins, he set the team in motion, and they began the journey toward Trinidad. Abigail resisted the urge to look back again, focusing instead on the road ahead and the uncertain future that awaited her. They traveled in companionable silence for much of the morning, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady plodding of the horses' hooves creating a soothing backdrop to Abigail's thoughts. The familiar landscape rolled by the gently undulating plains, the distant mountains, the occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking the presence of water in this arid land. "Have you decided where you'll stay in town?" Luke asked eventually, breaking the silence. "Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, at least for now," Abigail replied. "She had a room available when I inquired last week." Luke nodded. "I know the place. Clean, respectable. Mrs. Fletcher runs a tight establishment. You've stayed there before?" Abigail asked, curious about his previous visits to Trinidad. "Once or twice passing through," he confirmed. "Trinidad's a natural stopping point for those heading north or south along the mountains." The conversation lapsed back into silence, but it was a comfortable one, neither of them feeling the need to fill the air with unnecessary words. As they crested a small rise in the road, the town of Trinidad came into view in the distance, its collection of buildings nestled in the valley below. "Looks like they're expanding again," Luke observed, nodding toward the edge of town where new construction was visible. "The railroad's been good for business, I imagine." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "It's grown considerably since Thomas and I first settled here. He used to say Trinidad would be a proper city someday, with everything Denver has to offer but closer to the mountains he loved." The mention of Thomas brought a fresh pang of grief, but it was tempered now by the passage of time and the acceptance that had gradually replaced denial in her heart. He was gone, but the life they had shared remained a precious memory, one she could carry with her wherever she went. As they drew closer to town, the road became more traveled, with other wagons and riders sharing the dusty path. Abigail was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. A woman traveling with a strange man would naturally attract attention in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. "People will talk," she said quietly to Luke. "About us arriving together." Luke shrugged, unconcerned. "Let them. Those who matter will know the truth of things." His casual dismissal of potential gossip was refreshing after the careful navigation of social expectations that had defined much of Abigail's life in Trinidad. As a widow living alone, she had been subject to constant scrutiny, her every action weighed against the community's standards of propriety. They reached the outskirts of town by mid-morning, the streets already busy with the day's activities. Luke guided the wagon deftly through the traffic, heading toward the modest building on Cedar Street that housed Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher herself was sweeping the front steps when they arrived, her stern countenance softening slightly at the sight of Abigail. "Mrs. Zimmerman," she called, "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "Our business concluded earlier than anticipated," Abigail explained as Luke brought the wagon to a halt before the boarding house. "I hope the room is ready." Of course, Mrs. Fletcher assured her, her curious gaze shifting to Luke. "And your companion, Mr. Sinclair, was kind enough to help me transport my belongings from the homestead," Abigail replied smoothly, stepping down from the wagon with Luke's assistance. "He's been most helpful during a difficult time." Mrs. Fletcher's expression registered both understanding and a certain wariness. "I see. Well, Mr. Sinclair, you're welcome to help bring Mrs. Zimmerman's things inside, but I'm afraid I don't have any rooms available for gentlemen at present." "No need to worry on my account, madam," Luke replied politely. "I've made other arrangements." With that settled, they began the task of unloading Abigail's possessions and carrying them up to the small room on the second floor that would be her new home for the foreseeable future. It was a clean, modest space with a narrow bed, a dresser, a small writing desk, and a window that overlooked the street below, a far cry from the open vistas of the homestead, but adequate for her immediate needs. As Luke brought in the last of her trunks, Abigail stood in the center of the room, trying to imagine herself building a new life within these confined walls. The prospect seemed both daunting and strangely liberating. "It's a good start," Luke said, seeming to read her thoughts. "A place to catch your breath before deciding what comes next." Abigail nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Yes, that's exactly what it is." With her belongings safely delivered, there was little reason for Luke to linger, yet Abigail found herself reluctant to bid him farewell. In the span of less than a week, he had become a significant presence in her life, a steady hand during her most vulnerable moment, a voice of reason when her own thoughts were clouded by emotion. "I should see about stabling Penny," she said, grasping for a reason to delay their parting. "And I need to speak with Mr. Davies at the general store about potential employment." "I can help with Penny," Luke offered. "There's a decent livery at the edge of town. As for employment—" He hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I heard the schoolteacher, Miss Holloway, is leaving at the end of the month. Getting married, apparently, might be worth inquiring about the position." The suggestion caught Abigail by surprise. "Teaching? I don't know if I'm qualified." "You said Thomas was a teacher," Luke reminded her. "And you're clearly educated. Worth considering, at least." The idea took root in Abigail's mind, growing more appealing the longer she contemplated it. Teaching had always interested her, though she had never pursued it formally. With Thomas's books and her own education, she might indeed be qualified enough for a small town like Trinidad. "I'll inquire about it," she decided. "Thank you for the suggestion." They made their way back downstairs, past Mrs. Fletcher's watchful gaze, and out to the wagon where Penny waited patiently. As they walked toward the livery stable, leading the horse and wagon through the busy streets, Abigail became increasingly aware that their time together was drawing to a close. "When will you leave for your brother's place?" she asked as they reached the stable. "Tomorrow, likely," Luke replied, negotiating with the stable master for Penny's care. "No reason to delay now that you're settled." Abigail nodded, trying to ignore the unexpected pang of disappointment his words evoked. "Of course. You've been more than generous with your time already." With Penny safely stabled and the wagon secured, they found themselves standing on the dusty street, the moment of parting having arrived with an abruptness that left Abigail unprepared. "I should let you get on with your day," Luke said, though he made no immediate move to leave. "You have much to arrange." "Yes," Abigail agreed, equally reluctant to end their association. "But perhaps, would you join me for supper this evening at the hotel restaurant as a small thank you for all your help?" Luke's expression warmed at her invitation. "I'd be honored, Abigail." They agreed on a time to meet, and then Luke tipped his hat and turned to go, leaving Abigail standing outside the livery with a curious mixture of emotions swirling within her. She watched his retreating figure until he disappeared around a corner, then squared her shoulders and set off to begin the task of rebuilding her life in Trinidad. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity, as Abigail reacquainted herself with the town that would now be her home. She visited the general store, where Mr. Davies reluctantly informed her that he had no positions available but suggested she try the milliner's shop on Commercial Street. The milliner, Mrs. Parsons, was more encouraging, offering Abigail part-time work assisting with hat trimming and alterations, not enough to live on indefinitely, but sufficient to supplement her savings while she searched for something more permanent. Following Luke's suggestion, Abigail also called at the schoolhouse, where she learned that the teaching position would indeed be available at the end of the month. The school board would be accepting applications, and while they preferred someone with teaching experience, they were willing to consider any qualified candidate given the limited options in a town like Trinidad. By late afternoon, Abigail returned to the boarding house to rest and prepare for her dinner with Luke. As she washed away the dust of the day and changed into her one remaining good dress, a navy blue with subtle white piping that Thomas had always admired, she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the enigmatic cowboy who had entered her life so unexpectedly. There was something about Luke Sinclair that defied easy categorization. He possessed the practical skills and resilience of a frontiersman, yet he read poetry with evident appreciation. He maintained a certain reserve, a careful distance in his interactions, yet had shown her extraordinary kindness during her darkest hour. He was, in many ways, a contradiction much like the West itself, with its brutal harshness existing alongside breathtaking beauty. Abigail arrived at the hotel restaurant a few minutes before their agreed-upon time, her nerves fluttering in a way that surprised her. This was merely a thank-you meal, she reminded herself, not a social engagement of any other significance. Yet as she waited, she found herself smoothing her dress and checking her hair with an attention to detail that belied her attempt at casual dismissal. Luke arrived precisely on time, and Abigail was struck by the transformation in his appearance. Gone were the dust-covered work clothes, replaced by a clean shirt, dark vest, and pressed trousers. His hair was neatly combed and he had shaved, revealing a strong jawline previously obscured by several days' growth of beard. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he greeted her formally, mindful of their public setting. "You look lovely this evening." "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair," she replied, matching his formality while appreciating the genuine warmth in his eyes. "Shall we?" The hotel restaurant was one of the finer establishments in Trinidad, catering to travelers and the town's more prosperous citizens. As they were shown to their table, Abigail was aware of the curious glances directed their way. The widow Zimmerman, dining with an unknown gentleman, would certainly provide fodder for local gossip. Once seated, however, the awareness of others' scrutiny faded as they fell into comfortable conversation. Abigail shared the results of her day's inquiries, including the promising lead at the schoolhouse. "I think you should pursue it," Luke encouraged her. "Teaching seems a natural fit for someone with your patience and intelligence." His compliment brought a flush of pleasure to Abigail's cheeks. "It would be a new challenge," she acknowledged. "But perhaps that's exactly what I need now, something entirely different from the life I've been living." Luke nodded in understanding. Sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the best destinations. Their meals arrived hearty Western fare of steak, potatoes, and seasonal vegetables, and they ate with the healthy appetite of those accustomed to physical labor. As they dined, their conversation flowed easily from topic to topic, touching on books they had both read, places they had traveled, and observations about the changing character of the West as civilization pushed ever further into once wild territories. "It's strange," Abigail remarked as they lingered over coffee after their meal. "A week ago, I was facing the loss of everything I thought defined my life. Now here I am, contemplating possibilities I never would have considered before." "Necessity often reveals strengths and opportunities we didn't know existed," Luke observed, "forces us to look beyond the familiar." "Is that what happened to you after the war?" Abigail asked, emboldened by the intimate atmosphere that had developed between them. Luke's expression grew distant for a moment, and Abigail feared she had overstepped. But then he nodded slowly. "In a way, the war stripped away many of my illusions about the world, about people, about myself. When it was over, I couldn't go back to being the person I had been before. So I came west looking for something, space maybe, room to figure out who I was going to be now. And have you figured it out?" Abigail's question was soft, genuine in its curiosity. Luke met her gaze with a thoughtful one of his own. "I'm still working on it," he admitted with a small smile. "But I think I'm closer than I was." As the evening drew to a close, they walked slowly back toward Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, the streets of Trinidad quieter now as businesses closed for the night and families retreated to their homes. The air was cool but pleasant, carrying the scent of sage from the surrounding hills. "Thank you for supper," Luke said as they paused before the boarding house steps. "It was a fine way to end my time in Trinidad." Abigail felt a sharp pang at the reminder of his imminent departure. "Will you come say goodbye before you leave tomorrow?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the request. Luke's expression softened. "Of course," he promised. "I wouldn't leave without saying a proper farewell." There was a moment of charged silence between them, filled with words unspoken and possibilities unexplored. Then, Luke took her hand gently in his and raised it to his lips, the brief contact sending an unexpected warmth through Abigail's entire body. "Good night, Abigail," he said softly, releasing her hand and stepping back. "Sleep well." "Good night, Luke," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched as he walked away, his figure gradually fading into the darkness of the street. Only when he had disappeared completely did she turn and enter the boarding house, her mind filled with thoughts she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Morning brought with it a sense of inevitability as Abigail prepared for Luke's departure. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with images of the homestead, of Thomas, and increasingly of Luke Sinclair with his steady presence and storm-gray eyes. She rose early, wanting to be ready when he came to say goodbye. Mrs. Fletcher eyed her suspiciously over breakfast, clearly curious about Abigail's relationship with the stranger who had brought her to town. Abigail deflected her questions with polite vagueness, unwilling to subject her connection with Luke to the older woman's scrutiny. As the morning wore on, Abigail grew increasingly restless, alternating between unpacking her belongings and pausing at the window to watch for Luke's approach. When a knock finally came at her door shortly before noon, her heart leapt in her chest, a reaction that both surprised and dismayed her. Luke stood in the hallway, hat in hand, dressed once again in his trail clothes with his duster coat hanging from his broad shoulders. "I came to say goodbye as promised," he said simply. Abigail nodded, struggling to maintain her composure. "I appreciate that. Would you like to come in for a moment?" Luke hesitated, glancing down the hall toward the stairs where Mrs. Fletcher might appear at any moment. "Perhaps it would be better if we spoke outside," he suggested tactfully. Understanding his concern for her reputation, Abigail agreed, grabbing her shawl before following him downstairs and out onto the boardwalk in front of the boarding house. They walked a short distance in silence, stopping at a small bench beneath a cottonwood tree at the edge of the town square. "I wanted to thank you again," Abigail began, searching for the right words to express what his help had meant to her. "What you did coming when you did, helping me through all of this it was. I don't know if I would have found the strength to face it alone." Luke shook his head slightly. "You would have," he said with quiet conviction. "You're stronger than you know, Abigail, but I'm glad I was able to make it a little easier." They fell silent again, the unspoken weight of their imminent parting hanging heavily between them. Abigail found herself memorizing his features the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the strong hands that had worked so capably alongside her own. "I should be on my way," Luke said finally. "It's a long ride to Pueblo, and I'd like to make good progress before nightfall." Abigail nodded, unable to think of a reason to delay his departure that wouldn't reveal more of her feelings than she was prepared to acknowledge, even to herself. "Safe travels," she managed to say. "And thank you, Luke, for everything." Luke studied her face for a long moment, as if committing it to memory just as she had done with his. Then, with deliberate care, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "I have something for you," he said, offering it to her. A parting gift of sorts. Surprised, Abigail accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it to reveal a small, leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a simple but elegant design of wildflowers. "I noticed you didn't have one among your books," Luke explained. "Thought you might like to write down your thoughts as you start this new chapter. Sometimes it helps to put words to what we're feeling, makes it clearer somehow." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Abigail deeply. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Luke smiled, pleased by her reaction. "Consider it a small repayment for your hospitality." "You owe me nothing," Abigail assured him. "If anything, the debt is mine." "Then we'll call it even," Luke suggested, his smile warming his eyes. "No debts between friends. The words simultaneously comforted and disappointed Abigail, though she couldn't have explained why. "Yes," she agreed. "Friends." Luke rose from the bench, the moment of farewell having arrived. "I wish you all the best, Abigail Zimmerman. I hope Trinidad treats you kindly." "And I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for," Abigail replied, standing as well. "Safe travels, Luke Sinclair." For a brief moment, it seemed as if Luke might say something more, might reach out to her in some way. Instead, he simply nodded, touched the brim of his hat in a final salute, and turned to go. Abigail watched him walk away, clutching the journal to her chest as if it were a precious talisman. Only when he had disappeared from view did she allow herself to acknowledge the hollow feeling his departure had left within her, a sense of loss that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. With a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and turned back toward the boarding house. She had a new life to build, and dwelling on what might have been would not serve her now. Luke Sinclair had come into her life when she needed him most, had helped her navigate her darkest hour, and now he was gone, a chapter closed, just as her time at the homestead had come to an end. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of sorts as Abigail established her new life in Trinidad. She began working at the milliner's shop 3 days a week, her nimble fingers quickly mastering the art of hat trimming. In the evenings, she studied Thomas's old teaching materials, preparing for her interview with the school board at the end of the month. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, while comfortable enough, offered little privacy and even less warmth. The other residents, 2 elderly sisters and a middle-aged clerk from the bank, were polite but distant, more interested in their own affairs than in befriending a newcomer. Abigail found herself longing for the solitude of the homestead, for the open spaces and the sense of independence she had taken for granted until it was gone. In her loneliest moments, she would open the journal Luke had given her and write about her fears and hopes, about memories of Thomas and their life together, about the uncertain future that stretched before her. The simple act of putting words on paper provided a comfort she hadn't expected, just as Luke had suggested it might. And if, occasionally, her thoughts strayed to the man himself, to his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way his rare smile transformed his face, she tried not to dwell on these reflections. Luke Sinclair had his own path to follow, just as she had hers. Their brief intersection had been a stroke of fortune, nothing more. 2 weeks after Luke's departure, Abigail received an unexpected visit at the milliner's shop. She was sorting ribbons when the bell above the door chimed, announcing a customer. Looking up, she was startled to see Edward Carlson, the rancher who had purchased her homestead. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I hoped I might find you here." "Mr. Carlson," Abigail replied, setting aside her work. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," Carlson assured her. "I was in town on business, and thought I should let you know that we found some items at the homestead that appear to be personal in nature, letters, primarily, and a few small keepsakes that must have been overlooked when you packed." Relief washed over Abigail. She had been worried that some problem had arisen with the sale. "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Carlson. I would appreciate having them returned." "I've left them with Sheriff Miller at his office," Carlson informed her. "You can collect them at your convenience." Abigail thanked him, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, Carlson departed, leaving her to wonder what items had been found. She couldn't recall leaving anything of significance behind, having been meticulous in her packing despite the emotional strain of the moment. That evening, after finishing her shift at the milliner's shop, Abigail made her way to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, a gruff but fair man who had known Thomas, greeted her with a nod and produced a small wooden box from a drawer in his desk. "Carlson's foreman brought this in yesterday," he explained, passing the box to Abigail. "Said they found it when they were clearing out the root cellar." Abigail opened the box with curious fingers, finding inside a collection of letters she and Thomas had exchanged during their courtship, a small daguerreotype of her parents that she had thought lost years ago, and most surprisingly, Thomas's pocket watch, a prized possession she had searched for extensively before leaving the homestead, convinced it must have been misplaced somewhere among her belongings. "Thank you for keeping these safe," she said to the sheriff, clutching the box to her chest. "They're irreplaceable to me." Sheriff Miller nodded in understanding, glad they found their way back to you. He hesitated, then added, "How are you settling in at Mrs. Fletcher's?" "Finding your feet in town." "Well enough," Abigail replied, touched by his concern. I'm working at the milliner's shop for now and hoping to apply for the teaching position when Miss Holloway leaves. You'd make a fine teacher, the sheriff observed. Thomas always spoke highly of your intelligence, said you helped him prepare his lessons sometimes. The mention of Thomas's regard for her abilities warmed Abigail's heart. Yes, I enjoyed that. Teaching has always interested me. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a deputy with a matter requiring the sheriff's attention. Abigail bid him goodbye and stepped out into the early evening, the box of recovered memories tucked securely under her arm. As she walked back toward the boarding house, Abigail's thoughts drifted to Luke, as they often did in quiet moments. Would he have reached his brother's place by now? Was he finding the work satisfying? Would he settle there, or would the restlessness that seemed to define him drive him onward to new horizons? She had no answers to these questions, and no expectation of ever receiving them. Their paths had crossed briefly, meaningfully, and now they had diverged again, each of them continuing on their separate journeys, carrying the memory of their shared experience like a stone in their pocket, smooth and familiar to the touch. Back in her small room at the boarding house, Abigail lit a lamp and settled on the bed to examine the contents of the box more thoroughly. The letters brought back vivid memories of her early days with Thomas, his courtship, their shared dreams, the youthful optimism that had carried them through the challenges of establishing a home in the unforgiving Colorado landscape. The daguerreotype of her parents, taken just before her father's death when Abigail was 16, was a particularly precious find. She had few tangible reminders of her parents, and the photograph captured them as she remembered them, her father tall and serious, her mother gentle-eyed with the same honey-blonde hair Abigail had inherited. Thomas's pocket watch, however, was the most surprising discovery. It had been a gift from his father, one of the few possessions he had brought west with him. Abigail had assumed it was buried with him, but now she realized someone, likely the neighbor who had helped prepare his body, must have removed it and placed it in the root cellar for safekeeping, only to forget to return it to her in the confusion of the funeral arrangements. As she opened the watch, a small folded paper fell out onto the bedspread. Curious, Abigail unfolded it to find a note in Thomas's neat handwriting. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, I am no longer by your side. I hope that I have lived a long and loving life with you, but if fate has decreed otherwise, know that my greatest fortune was to have called you my wife. You have a strength that you yourself do not see, a resilience that will carry you through whatever life may bring. Trust in that strength, my love, and know that I am watching over you always. With eternal love, Thomas." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she read and reread the message, her husband's voice seeming to echo from beyond the grave with words of encouragement when she needed them most. It was as if he had somehow known she would find this note at precisely the moment when she was trying to rebuild her life, when reassurance of her own capabilities was the greatest gift she could receive. Wiping away her tears, Abigail carefully folded the note and placed it back inside the watch. Then, reaching for the journal Luke had given her, she began to write about finding Thomas's message, about the strange confluence of events that had brought both loss and opportunity into her life, about the gradual realization that she was indeed stronger than she had believed. When she finally set the journal aside and extinguished the lamp, Abigail felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's illness. The past could not be changed, but perhaps it could serve as a foundation for a future. She was only beginning to envision a future in which she might find fulfillment and someday, perhaps, even joy again. The following week brought Abigail's interview with the school board, a panel of 5 men responsible for educational matters in Trinidad. She dressed carefully in her best dress, her hair neatly arranged, and presented herself at the town hall precisely at the appointed time. The questioning was thorough but fair, focusing on her educational background, her familiarity with various subjects, and her approach to teaching. Abigail answered honestly, drawing on her experiences helping Thomas and her own continuing studies. When asked about her qualifications compared to other candidates, she spoke of her deep belief in the value of education and her understanding of the community's needs, having lived in the area for several years. Mrs. Zimmerman, the board chairman said as the interview concluded, "We appreciate your interest in the position. We'll be making our decision within the week and will notify you either way." Abigail thanked them for their consideration and left the town hall feeling cautiously optimistic. She had done her best, spoken from the heart, and now could only wait for their verdict. 3 days later, a messenger delivered a letter to the boarding house. Abigail opened it with trembling fingers to find that she had been offered the teaching position, contingent upon a satisfactory demonstration lesson to be given before the board the following week. The salary was modest but sufficient, especially when combined with her savings, to allow her to consider more permanent housing arrangements than the boarding house could provide. That evening, Abigail wrote in her journal with renewed vigor, mapping out plans for her future with an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in months. She would need to find a small house to rent, preferably near the schoolhouse. She would want to establish a proper routine for her studies and lesson preparations. Perhaps she might even, in time, create a small garden similar to the one she had tended at the homestead. As she wrote, her thoughts turned inevitably to Luke. She wished she could share this news with him, thank him for encouraging her to pursue the teaching position. His belief in her abilities had come at a crucial moment, bolstering her confidence when she most needed it. But he was gone, continuing his own journey, unaware of the impact he had made on hers. The demonstration lesson went well, Abigail's natural patience and clear explanations impressing both the school board and the small group of children gathered to participate in the exercise. By the end of May, she had been officially installed as Trinidad's new teacher, with classes to begin after the summer break in September. With her position secured and a steady income assured, Abigail was able to find a small but comfortable house to rent on the eastern edge of town. It was nothing like the homestead, a simple 2-room structure with a tiny yard, but it was her own space, free from the watchful eyes and implicit judgments of Mrs. Fletcher and her other boarders. June brought the first real rains in over a year, drenching the parched Colorado landscape and bringing a surge of green to the hills surrounding Trinidad. Abigail often stood on her small porch in the evenings, watching the storms roll in from the mountains, thinking of how the rain would be reviving the land at her former homestead, preparing it for Carlson's cattle. She had settled into a satisfying routine, dividing her time between preparations for the coming school term and establishing her new home. She had made a few acquaintances in town who were gradually becoming friends' fellow churchgoers, the young woman who ran the library, a pair of sisters who lived nearby and often invited her for tea. Yet despite these positive developments, Abigail sometimes found herself gazing westward, wondering about the man who had appeared so unexpectedly in her moment of need, and disappeared just as abruptly once that need had passed. In her more fanciful moments, she imagined Luke returning to Trinidad, perhaps settling nearby, their paths crossing again under happier circumstances. But such thoughts were merely dreams. She reminded herself pleasant diversions but not to be confused with reality. Reality, as Abigail well knew, rarely conformed to one's wishes. It had a way of unfolding according to its own inscrutable design, bringing both trials and blessings in equal measure. Her task was simply to meet each day with the strength Thomas had recognized in her, and the resilience Luke had helped her rediscover. July arrived with sweltering heat, the brief respite provided by the June rains giving way to the typical summer drought of the region. Abigail spent her mornings working on lesson plans and her afternoons indoors, seeking refuge from the oppressive temperature. In the cooler evenings, she would sometimes ride Penny out beyond the town limits, enjoying the freedom of movement and the changing light on the distant mountains. It was during one such evening ride, as Abigail was returning to town along the southern road, that she spotted a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Her heart leapt in her chest as recognition dawned the set of the shoulders, the distinctive hat, the easy way he sat his mount. Luke Sinclair was returning to Trinidad. Abigail reined Penny to a halt at the side of the road, uncertainty washing over her. Should she wait for him to reach her? Ride on as if she hadn't recognized him? Her decision was made for her when Luke spotted her and raised a hand in greeting, guiding his horse toward her with purpose. "Abigail," he called as he drew closer, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "Is that really you?" Abigail managed a smile despite the sudden fluttering in her chest. "It's me," she confirmed as Luke brought his horse alongside hers. "Welcome back to Trinidad." Luke studied her face with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "You're looking well," he said finally. "Town life seems to agree with you." "I've been fortunate," Abigail acknowledged. "I secured the teaching position. Classes start in September." A genuine smile broke across Luke's face, transforming his features in the way she remembered so vividly. "That's wonderful news. I knew you'd be perfect for it." His approval shouldn't have mattered so much, yet Abigail found herself unreasonably pleased by it. "And you?" she asked. "How was your time in Pueblo?" "Productive," Luke replied. "My brother's spread is doing well. He wanted me to stay on permanently, but—" He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the distant mountains before returning to her face. "I had unfinished business elsewhere." Something in his tone made Abigail's pulse quicken. "Oh," she managed, striving for a casual tone. "What brings you back to Trinidad, then?" Luke's expression grew serious. "I think you know, Abigail." The directness of his response caught her off guard. "I'm not sure I do," she said carefully, though a part of her feared she understood exactly what he meant. Luke guided his horse a few steps closer to hers, close enough that Abigail could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the tiny lines at their corners deepening as he regarded her intently. "When I left here 2 months ago," he began, "I told myself I was doing the right thing, giving you space to find your footing, to start your new life without complications. But the farther I rode, the more I realized I was making a mistake." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've spent years drifting, Abigail, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I told myself it was freedom I was after, but I think it was really just fear of caring too much, of having something to lose again." Abigail listened, barely breathing as Luke continued, his voice low and earnest. "Meeting you changed something in me. Watching you face the loss of everything you'd built, seeing the courage it took for you to start again, it made me reconsider what I've been running from all these years." His gaze held hers, unwavering. "I came back to ask if there might be a place for me in Trinidad, in your life if you're willing." The words Abigail had secretly hoped to hear, had imagined in moments of solitary reflection, now hung in the air between them, real and immediate and requiring a response. She searched Luke's face, finding nothing but sincerity in his expression. "Luke," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I won't pretend I haven't thought of you these past months. But are you certain this is what you want? A settled life in one place, not just any place," Luke clarified. "Here with you, if you'll have me." The simple honesty of his declaration touched something deep within Abigail, a place that had been dormant since Thomas's death, a capacity for hope she had thought might never awaken again. "I don't know what this is between us," she admitted. "It happened so quickly, under such unusual circumstances. But I do know that when you left, something was missing that hadn't been missing before you came." Luke's expression softened. "I felt the same absence," he said quietly. "Every mile that took me farther from you only made it more apparent." They sat on their horses in the gathering dusk, the weight of their mutual confession creating a fragile, precious moment neither seemed willing to break. Finally, Abigail spoke again, her decision made. "I think," she said carefully, "that if you're serious about staying in Trinidad, we should take the time to discover what this might become, properly, without the pressure of imminent departures or foreclosures hanging over us." Luke nodded, understanding in his eyes. "A fresh start on equal footing." "Exactly," Abigail agreed, relief washing over her at his comprehension. "I have my teaching position beginning in September. What will you do here?" "I've been considering that," Luke replied. "I noticed on my way into town that the livery stable has a sign advertising for an experienced horse trainer. It's work I know well, and would provide a steady income." Abigail smiled, the practical details somehow making the possibility of their shared future seem more real. "That sounds promising." "It's a start," Luke agreed. "From there, who knows? Trinidad's growing. There are opportunities for a man willing to work hard and put down roots." The mention of roots brought a warmth to Abigail's chest. Luke Sinclair, the drifter who had appeared like a mirage in her moment of need, was contemplating permanence and doing so with her in mind. "It's getting dark," she observed reluctantly. "We should head back to town." Luke nodded in agreement, and they turned their horses toward Trinidad, riding side by side as the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the evening sky. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with possibility rather than the finality that had marked their previous parting. As the lights of town came into view, Luke spoke again. "May I call on you tomorrow? Perhaps we could have dinner again, talk more about what happens next." "I'd like that," Abigail replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm living in the small white house at the east end of Cedar Street now. You can find me there after 4. They rode the rest of the way into town, separating at the livery stable where Abigail left Penny for the night. As they said their temporary goodbyes, Luke took her hand gently in his touch sending a now familiar warmth through her veins. "Until tomorrow, then," he said softly. "Tomorrow," Abigail confirmed, reluctantly withdrawing her hand and turning toward the path that would take her home. As she walked through the quiet streets of Trinidad, Abigail felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for too long. Luke had returned, not just to Trinidad but to her, drawn back by the same inexplicable connection she had felt growing between them during their brief time together. What that connection might become remained to be seen, but for the first time since losing the homestead, since losing Thomas, if she were truly honest with herself, Abigail found herself looking forward to the future with genuine anticipation rather than resigned acceptance. Back in her small house, Abigail lit a lamp and reached for Luke's journal. She had filled many pages since his departure, chronicling her transition to town life, her successes and setbacks, her gradual healing. Tonight, she would add a new entry, one that acknowledged the unexpected turn her journey had taken with Luke's return and her own willingness to explore where this new path might lead. As she wrote, Abigail remembered the moment when everything had seemed darkest, when she had stood on the porch of her homestead and told Luke that her hope was gone. He had promised gently, his eyes never leaving hers, "I'll hope enough for both of us." At the time, she had thought it a kind but ultimately meaningless reassurance. Now, she wondered if he had somehow seen more clearly than she had, if he had recognized the possibility of renewal that she had been too wounded to perceive. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation as Abigail went about her usual tasks, working on lesson plans, tending to her small garden, visiting the general store for supplies. Throughout it all, her thoughts repeatedly returned to Luke and the evening that lay ahead, the next step in this unexpected journey they had begun together. At precisely 4 o'clock, a knock sounded at her door. Abigail smoothed her dress, a simple but becoming lavender cotton she had recently finished altering, and took a deep breath before answering. Luke stood on her small porch, hat in hand, his expression warming as she appeared in the doorway. "Good afternoon, Abigail," he greeted her, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. "These are for you." He presented a modest bouquet of wildflowers, freshly gathered from the hills outside town. "They're beautiful," Abigail said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Please, come in while I put them in water." Luke followed her inside, his gaze taking in the simple but comfortable space she had created for herself. Abigail was suddenly aware of how different this was from their previous encounters, meeting as equals in her own established home, with no crisis looming over them. "You've made a real home here," Luke observed as she arranged the flowers in a jar. "It suits you." "It's small, but it's mine," Abigail replied, pleased by his approval. "Or it will be eventually. I'm renting for now, but Mr. Davies at the general store says the owner might be willing to sell in a year or so if I'm interested." Luke nodded appreciatively. Smart thinking. Property in a growing town like Trinidad is a good investment. The practicality of the conversation helped ease the initial awkwardness, allowing them to find their footing in this new context. As Abigail finished with the flowers and turned to face him fully, Luke's expression grew more serious. "I spoke with the owner of the livery stable this morning," he said. "He's offered me the position. If things work out, it could become a partnership eventually. He's getting on in years, looking for someone to take over when he retires." "That's wonderful news," Abigail exclaimed, genuinely happy for him. "When do you start?" "Monday," Luke replied with a smile. "Which means I have a few days to find more permanent lodging than the hotel. I was hoping you might have suggestions." Abigail considered the question. "Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house has rooms, but—" She trailed off, remembering the older woman's rigid rules and constant scrutiny. "But it's not ideal for someone hoping to establish themselves independently," Luke finished for her, understanding in his voice. "I was thinking more along the lines of a small cabin or house to rent, something similar to your arrangement." "There's a place on the west side of town that might suit," Abigail suggested. "It belonged to Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith who passed away last winter. His nephew inherited it but lives in Denver. I believe it's been standing empty." Luke nodded thoughtfully. "I'll inquire about it tomorrow. Thank you for the suggestion." He paused, then added with a hint of mischief in his eyes, "Now I believe I promised you dinner. There's a new restaurant that's opened since I was last here, Italian food apparently. Would you care to try it?" Abigail laughed, charmed by his enthusiasm. "I've never had Italian food before." "Neither have I," Luke admitted. "Could be an adventure we share." The evening that followed was everything Abigail could have hoped for: comfortable conversation, new experiences shared, and a growing sense of possibility between them. The Italian restaurant, run by a family recently arrived from New York, served dishes unlike anything either of them had tasted before. They approached the unfamiliar food with equal parts curiosity and amusement, finding in their shared discovery a metaphor for the journey they were beginning together. As summer progressed, Luke established himself in Trinidad. He secured the rental of the Peterson property, a small but sturdy cabin with enough land attached for a garden and perhaps eventually a few horses of his own. His work at the livery stable quickly earned him a reputation as a skilled trainer with a particular gift for handling difficult animals. Abigail, meanwhile, continued her preparations for the upcoming school term, often consulting with Luke on practical matters related to the schoolhouse and its needs. Their professional lives developed in parallel, each finding fulfillment in their chosen work while their personal relationship deepened through regular dinners, Sunday afternoon rides into the surrounding countryside, and quiet evenings spent sharing books and conversation. By August, their courtship was acknowledged throughout Trinidad, their appearances together at church or community events no longer raising eyebrows or prompting gossip. Abigail found in Luke a companion whose strength complemented her own, whose understanding of loss and renewal matched her experience, and whose growing love for her was expressed not just in words but in countless small acts of consideration and support. For Luke, Abigail represented everything he had been seeking without fully realizing it: a home, a purpose, a connection to something larger than himself. In her quiet determination and resilience, he found inspiration for his own efforts to build a settled life after years of restless wandering. As September approached, bringing with it the start of Abigail's teaching career, Luke asked her to accompany him on a special outing. They rode east from town one crisp morning, following a familiar path that Abigail gradually recognized with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. "Are we going to the homestead?" she asked as the landscape became increasingly familiar. Luke nodded, his expression gentle but determined. "If that's all right with you, there's something I'd like to show you." Abigail hesitated, uncertain how she would feel seeing her former home again. "I'm not sure." "Trust me," Luke said simply. "Please." Something in his tone convinced her, and Abigail nodded her agreement, steeling herself for the emotions that would inevitably arise when they reached their destination. As they crested the final rise, the homestead came into view below them. Abigail's breath caught in her throat at the sight. The drought-stricken land she had last seen was now a sea of green, the summer rains having restored life to the parched earth. Carlson's cattle grazed contentedly in the distance, and the buildings, the cabin, barn, and outbuildings all showed signs of recent repair and care. "It's thriving again," she murmured, surprised by the lack of pain in the observation. Instead, she felt a quiet satisfaction that the land she and Thomas had loved was being properly tended. "Carlson's a good steward," Luke agreed. "But that's not why I brought you here." He guided his horse forward, and Abigail followed, curious despite her lingering apprehension. They rode past the main buildings toward a spot Abigail knew well, a small rise overlooking the property, where a solitary cottonwood tree provided shade, and where she and Thomas had often sat in the evenings, planning their future. As they approached, Abigail noticed something new beneath the tree: a small wooden marker, carefully crafted and set firmly in the ground. Drawing closer, she saw that it bore Thomas's name, dates of birth and death, and a simple inscription: "Beloved husband and teacher, who dreamed of a life in the West and lived it fully." Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she dismounted and approached the marker. "How?" she began, turning to Luke, who had joined her beneath the tree. "I spoke with Carlson," Luke explained. told him about Thomas, how he'd never had a proper marker. Carlson was surprisingly understanding, said every man deserves to be remembered where he built something lasting. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. I hope I haven't overstepped. Abigail shook her head, deeply moved by Luke's thoughtfulness. It's perfect, she said softly, kneeling to touch the smooth wood of the marker. Thank you. They stood together in silence for several minutes, paying quiet respect to the man whose absence had indirectly led to their meeting. Finally, Abigail rose and turned to face Luke, her eyes clear and direct. You did this for me, she said, not a question but a recognition. To help me make peace with the past. Luke nodded, his expression serious. The past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. Sometimes we need a place to acknowledge what was before we can fully embrace what might be. His words resonated deeply with Abigail, articulating something she had felt but hadn't been able to express. And what might be, Luke? She asked softly. What do you see for us? Luke took her hands in his gaze steady and sure. I see a life built together, Abigail. A home, work that matters to us both, perhaps a family someday. He smiled, a tender expression that reached his eyes. I see a future where we face whatever comes side by side, drawing strength from each other. Abigail felt a wave of emotion sweep through her, not grief or regret, but a profound gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken and the man who now stood before her, offering a new beginning. I want that too, she admitted, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened. With you, Luke, I want to build that future together. Luke's smile broadened, joy and relief evident in his expression. From his pocket, he withdrew a small box and opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a modest pearl. Then will you marry me, Abigail Zimmerman? Will you make a home with me, share your strength with me, allow me to love you for all the days we're granted? Abigail looked from the ring to Luke's face, finding in his eyes all the hope and promise she had once thought lost forever. Yes, she said simply, her heart full. Yes, I will marry you, Luke Sinclair. As Luke slipped the ring onto her finger, Abigail was struck by the journey that had brought them to this moment from the darkest day of her life, when she had told a stranger her hope was gone, to this pinnacle of new beginnings, standing with the same man who had promised to hope enough for them both. In the end, his hope had rekindled her own, proving that even in the harshest landscape of loss, new growth was possible, and with it, the promise of a love deeper and more resilient for having weathered the storm. They were married in October, after the start of the school term, in a simple ceremony at Trinidad's small church. The community turned out in force to witness the union of their new schoolteacher and the increasingly respected horse trainer, who had become fixtures in town life. Sheriff Miller gave the bride away, and among the guests was Edward Carlson, whose purchase of Abigail's homestead had ultimately freed her to begin the journey that led to this day. Luke had secured a loan to purchase the Peterson property outright, providing them with a permanent home that they gradually expanded and improved as their circumstances allowed. Abigail's teaching and Luke's work at the livery stable, which indeed developed into a partnership as the original owner aged, provided them with a comfortable living and standing in the growing community of Trinidad. In the spring of 1877, their first child was born, a son they named Thomas Luke Sinclair, honoring both the past and the present in his naming. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Elizabeth Abigail, completing their household with her bright eyes and determined spirit. As Trinidad grew from a frontier settlement into a proper town, the Sinclairs grew with it. Luke eventually purchased the livery stable outright, expanding it to include a breeding operation for quality horses that gained recognition throughout the region. Abigail continued teaching until the birth of their third child in 1882, after which she focused on raising their children and contributing to community initiatives, particularly those related to education and supporting other women facing challenging circumstances. They never forgot how they had met in a moment of crisis that had revealed the strength in both of them and the possibility of finding love when it was least expected. Each year, on the anniversary of the day Luke had first ridden up to Abigail's homestead, they would ride out to the cottonwood tree where Thomas's marker stood, paying their respects to the past that had shaped them while celebrating the life they had built together. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, they would sometimes remind each other of the promise that had started it all, spoken in a moment of despair, but fulfilled in countless days of joy and purpose. "I'll hope enough for both of us." In the end, there had been more than enough hope to sustain them both enough to build a home, raise a family, and create a legacy of love and resilience that would endure long after the memory of their initial struggles had faded into the rich tapestry of their shared life. For in finding each other, Luke and Abigail had discovered that the greatest strength comes not from facing adversity alone, but from facing it together, with the courage to hope when hope seems lost, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the end of one dream is merely the beginning of another, more beautiful than could have been imagined.